James, if you can send them to me live, I can let them know we're having technical difficulties. Hi, I'm Inga Kennedy, and on behalf of the Wood Consulting Team and the City of South Fulton, thank you for your interest and participation in the zoning rewrite update process. We have some updates for you. Our preference would be to meet with you in person. However, that is not possible at this time. We have coordinated an alternative process to engage with you and to bring these updates to you virtually. This presentation will share some key recommendations from the draft zoning rewrite update. Lee Walton, our project manager, will conduct the presentation. He will also identify important next steps for you to follow to provide input to us on what you hear. Again, thank you so much for your participation. And here's Lee.
Thank you, Inga, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. This is not the format that we would prefer, but we have the opportunity to carry forward with the zoning ordinance rewrite project and using the virtual open house method. And so we appreciate your patience and we appreciate your attendance and your review of the recommendations that we have. What I'll be reviewing tonight is information that is all posted on the City of South Fulton website. You can see the address at the bottom of this slide, City of South Fulton Zoning Ordinance Rewrite webpage. Presentation handout notes, zoning map, file links for additional items to review, and the email address to use for questions and comments, all located on that. And we will also reiterate all of these points later in this presentation. So the agenda to review tonight, and I will go through this relatively quickly. We hope to get to questions and answers and to have plenty of time to engage in discussion. I'll review the zoning rewrite goals, the whole purpose and process for this effort, overview key recommendations, describe next steps, and then we will shift to our live Q&A format. So zoning rewrite goals. We started this process some time ago with the intent to customize the zoning ordinance so that it will meet the specific needs of the City of South Fulton. If you'll recall, the zoning ordinance as it currently exists was adapted from the Fulton County zoning ordinance that has been in place for many, many years and decades. Very importantly also to update the ordinance for compliance with state and federal laws, to address emerging trends and local issues, to reorganize the ordinance for ease of use. I'll describe how it's been substantially reorganized and refined, and then very importantly to coordinate the zoning ordinance with other planning documents, which I'll describe as well. So the rewrite process, we started with extensive public input over almost a year of process. We concurrently conducted technical analysis. More recently, we've been completing the draft document, and we're about to enter the review and adoption phase. So public input to date, again, a long process of public input, many different types of meetings, surveys, different formats were used. We received over 500 public comments, over 520 public comments from surveys, comment forms, and public meetings. We've met many times with the City Council, Planning Commission. We've held public workshops. We've had multiple town hall meetings and over 10 other and additional community meetings. We received a wide range of public input, and so as we were working through the process of public involvement and input for the zoning rewrite, there were several concurrent efforts underway. The comprehensive plan is an upcoming effort, but the comprehensive transportation plan, a parks and recreation plan, and economic development plan were all ongoing efforts. So as we collected public comments, we organized them, sorted them. Those that applied to the zoning rewrite, we have incorporated into this process. Those that applied to more directly to other processes, we forwarded comments, and we have placed a series of comments in reserve to be addressed through the upcoming comprehensive plan update. Technical analysis was concurrent with public input. We reviewed public comments and we assessed them, and we also reviewed and assessed the ordinance itself and input from the technical specialists on staff in different departments, and their opinions, their identified challenges with the existing ordinance, and all factors of it. And you see here a list of meetings we had with staff, with fire, business licensing, engineering, code enforcement, et cetera, to understand how the zoning ordinance does and does not work for them, what improvements are needed, what problems need to be solved. We also analyzed the zoning map in detail to evaluate opportunities for consolidating districts and for removing inactive districts. We reviewed the zoning ordinance for compliance with state and federal case law and regulations. The draft document has been reorganized into a series of 10 articles. That's a reduction from 34 articles that are in the existing zoning ordinance. It's not that we cut out 2/3 of the content necessarily, but we have streamlined and reorganized the key content into these 10 articles as listed here. Document framework, as you'll see on this slide, which is again available on the city's website, if you click on the link, you will see details of the new framework. This slide illustrates where the various provisions from the original 34 articles have been incorporated into the new 10 articles. And this slide does as well. I encourage you to review the more detailed information available from the website. So key substantive recommendations beyond the work of reorganizing, formatting, and streamlining are, according to these topics listed on this slide, we've done key work in the areas of allowed uses in zoning districts, overlay districts, development standards, process and procedures, and legal conformity. Regarding allowed uses, the key issues and needs that have been addressed, one, certainly the need for a comprehensive list of uses specifying allowed versus prohibited uses, which is currently unclear in many circumstances in the zoning ordinances. You will see as we go further that there's a very detailed now table of uses that is going to be a guide for planners and for applicants in the future. There have been ambiguities with classification of certain uses that has left the need for interpretation. There's been a need for greater distinction between neighborhood commercial uses and general commercial uses, and all the different types of commercial uses. There are many, many that have not been addressed specifically in the zoning ordinance up to this point. And then in some cases, there's been a need identified to tighten restrictions for certain uses regarding distances, numbers, etc. So we'll review these points. In terms of goals, for all uses, there's a goal to consolidate, expand, and customize, and present all of the information in a user-friendly table format. For non-residential uses, intent to reduce ambiguities with classification of uses that are not expressly referenced. And there are many that were not expressly referenced in the zoning ordinance as it existed. For residential uses, the focus is more on enhancement to existing residential development standards. Some key recommendations that we have executed, that we are executing through the draft process and completing, updating, and expanding C1 allowed uses to make them more neighborhood oriented and differentiated from the higher intensity C2 uses. We're evaluating uses to support economic development plan recommendations, which are nearly finalized. We're limiting non-residential uses in the mixed CGA, that's the Cedar Grove area, to ensure allowed uses are compatible with the Cedar Grove agricultural overlay area. We are identifying uses in all circumstances that are allowed, as opposed to only listing prohibited uses. In the ordinance up to this point, in the industrial categories, the only listings of uses have been those that are prohibited, leaving wide open a huge range of possibilities that aren't specifically listed as prohibited. We are reorganizing it so that in industrial, as in all the other categories, the listing of uses specifies which uses are allowed or allowed with a special exception. Those not listed are understood to be not allowed. Regarding the images on this page, for example, it has been the case that incinerators are prohibited in the city of South Fulton, and that continues to be the case. However, the zoning ordinance has not, up to this point, specified that industrial flex space is either allowed or prohibited in the industrial districts. So we have clearly identified where it is appropriately allowable, and that is one of the most popular and economic advantageous uses in your industrial districts at this point. There has been in place over the past year nearly a moratorium on certain uses in the city of South Fulton. This table lists those uses that have been subject to the moratorium, and one of our tasks through the process has been to address those specific uses in a way that will allow them to be appropriately addressed in the zoning ordinance. So these next slides identify the manner in which we are approaching each of these specific uses within the ordinance. For example, check cashing, which has been allowed by right in C2, is modified to be allowed with special use approval by council in C2. That's a typical approach for many of these uses that have been the subject of the moratorium. And if you will, again, go to the city's webpage, you'll be able to review each of these and the proposed approach in detail. It continues on this slide with examples that are also included in the moratorium. As far as the new use tables are concerned, the classification system that we follow and are consistent with is called the NAICS system, North American Industry Classification System. This, very importantly, is the same system that is used for occupational tax licenses, otherwise known as business licenses in the city. So as a result of using the NAICS system for zoning, we establish consistency between zoning and business license in the city of South Fulton. Very importantly, this approach gives us a much more comprehensive list of uses so that the uses that are currently being proposed, especially in non-commercial and non-residential settings, are specifically identified and defined through the NAICS system. It provides much better guidance for property owners as well as city staff and officials. And again, it will help facilitate occupational tax permits and the application processing for business licenses, which are coordinated with the zoning process. The tables in the zoning ordinance will now look like this, whereas in the past, there were simple lists of uses within each category. Now there is a consolidated table that allows a user, staff, or applicant to go into the ordinance and to review the entire list per use and look across the table to see which categories the use is either allowed as a special use, or prohibited by means of it being blank. The full use tables are available for review on the city's website through the links shown on this slide, and also are directly available on the Zoning Rewrite webpage. Text amendments have been taking place over the past couple of years, and there are some recent text amendments that we have incorporated into the standards, including those addressing party houses, food trucks, gas stations, and convenience stores. Additionally, we have turned the definitions section into a proper glossary, and we have located all of the definitions, many of which had been scattered throughout the zoning ordinance, into the single glossary location. So what are some key issues and needs that have been addressed? Consolidating and streamlining the active zoning districts and providing standards for inactive zoning districts that currently do not have parcels in the city. Some key recommendations related to the zoning map. Streamlining zoning districts. We've had 3 industrial M categories. 2 are essentially the same. So through the process, we're incorporating the M1A industrial park standards into M1 and removing M1A. We're also removing inactive districts that do not have zoned parcels showing up on the zoning map, including sub B and AO. And removing the hidden, in quotes, mixed CGA and CUP CGA districts out of the Cedar Grove agricultural overlay and putting those in the new Article 2 alongside other zoning districts. This doesn't make a difference on the map as much as it does in the text. Very importantly, we have city staff, work with city staff through the process to update the zoning map, to clarify it and to make it consistent with the process of the zoning rewrite. As you'll see on this slide, you're able to click to view the zoning map in detail. The draft updated zoning map is also available on the zoning rewrite webpage. Very importantly, this process does not result in rezoning, as it's traditionally understood, of any property. This process overall is a text amendment, and associated with it, there is the revised, updated zoning map, but we are not rezoning specific properties through this process. Any such rezoning of specific properties would follow as a separate, properly structured process. Some other needs being addressed concern overlay districts and the needs in different circumstances to effectively tweak the overlay districts to meet issues, objectives. We have not made wholesale revisions to the overlay districts. We have understood that the overlay districts serve an important purpose and that they were each developed uniquely with the location or the geography of the overlay in mind. Instead, we have focused on specific areas where public comments and analysis working with staff has identified needs for changes, such as those shown here. So some key recommendations that we're executing: we are extensively reorganizing the content to make these overlay districts easier to read, easier to use. We're maintaining the standards. We're making slight modifications. We've provided color palettes versus outdated descriptions of colors. We've updated the lighting standards to incorporate LED light technology and to be consistent with the recent Sandtown overlay. We're allowing increased building heights without a variance in some non-residential zoning districts in some overlay areas, particularly Old National. And we're applying citywide standards that will be reviewed in the upcoming development standards slides in circumstances where all overlays have the same standards. These This slide shows some additional overlay district concepts that are being developed and that would be subject to future efforts, such as expanding boundaries in some overlay districts or establishing new overlay districts where they don't currently exist. In order to execute these actions, a separate process is required with appropriate public input. So some standards have been addressed citywide through this process, specifically lighting standards, exterior cladding standards, reflective windows are being addressed, as well as buffers, building setbacks, and signs. On lighting, again, the recent Sandtown revisions are being put into effect citywide, including promoting LED lighting citywide. Also refining what has been existing in the ordinance as the night sky ordinance and making sure those standards for adequate illumination without light spillage are properly incorporated. Updating the night sky ordinance involves incorporating LED lighting and, as identified in this graphic, ensuring that lighting spillage doesn't extend beyond where light is intended. Exterior materials are addressed to promote higher quality development and to reduce maintenance issues long-term, specifically applicable to residential, but also to non-residential properties regarding synthetic siding products that may lead to quality issues. The key recommendations here are to prohibit vinyl siding and synthetic stucco as exterior wall cladding and to minimize wear and maintenance issues. This requirement applies to all residential dwelling types. Regarding reflective windows, there are concerns from code enforcement and public safety that a complete lack of visibility through windows poses security and safety issues. So tinting windows is okay. Complete mirrored windows is now prohibited through the ordinance. Recommendations such as this are illustrated in the Cascade Overlay District and other areas. Regarding buffers, which are an important element of the ordinance, the issues and needs that were identified include increasing buffer requirements between industrial and residential development, protecting residential areas from adjacent incompatible development, the fact that there are inadequate buffers between non-residential and residential properties within the city, and then also notions of the issues between residential properties and developments in the city and those developments occurring in adjacent jurisdictions. Key recommendations include increasing buffers between residential development and adjacent jurisdictions. So in cases where a housing development is taking place in the city of South Fulton that has a property line or a border that's adjacent to a different jurisdiction, there's a proposal for an additional zoning buffer to be required to ultimately protect the homeowners of the developments in the city of South Fulton. The city cannot control buffers or zoning factors in adjacent jurisdictions, but we can control, as South Fulton, the buffering within our jurisdiction. So that is a proposed new addition to the ordinance. With regards to setbacks, relatively minor changes are proposed. There was an issue identified of in more dense neighborhoods trying to avoid monotonous residential development or sort of walls of housing fronts that have very little variation. The proposal, as has been in effect informally for many years, is to require staggered setbacks along street frontages to improve the appearance of the streetscape. This applies specifically to R4, R4A, R5, and R5A districts, and amounts to a staggering of approximately 5 feet from one house to the next in setbacks. On the area of process and procedures, which is a very important article, it's addressed in both Articles 1 and 8 in the new ordinance arrangement. When you interact with the ordinance, with the city with regards to zoning, these processes and procedures guide your approach. So we have worked to clarify the difference between administrative use permits, and clarified and made a more traditional approach requiring special use approval where necessary. We've clarified regulations for conditional zoning. We've improved the communication process as defined in the ordinance for public hearings and meetings to provide better notice for residents. And we've updated the public engagement process for rezonings and for special use approvals. So specifically, we are reorganizing and renaming uses that require an administrative permit and a use permit. Use permit will now be changed to uses requiring special approval. The special approval criteria for special use requests are being incorporated in a manner that's consistent with the Georgia zoning procedures law. And many administrative permit uses are actually temporary special events or accessory uses that would require a special event permit or no additional permit other than a building permit. So clarification is being provided to be sure that only those uses that really require a special use permit process must go through the process. With regards to conditional zoning, key recommendations are to provide standards for imposing conditions of zoning that exceed current regulations. Conditions are only valid if they're included in the motion approving the rezoning. Conditions run with the land and are in effect as long as the zoning or special use is in effect. And this is simply clarifying the process of conditions that are added through the zoning process. With regards to public participation, what's listed on the right as the proposed process is actually the effective process for public participation during the zoning process, starting with a pre-application meeting, submittal of applications, a completeness review by staff, and then confirmation. Those first 4 steps effectively take place at the counter in City Hall between zoning staff and the applicant. Following that, the CZIM meeting, public participation meeting, public participation report to the Planning Commission, which is the obligation of the applicant, and the subsequent Planning Commission meeting and City Council meeting amounts to the public involvement process in each zoning effort. And so the ordinance is being modified to be consistent with this intended and actual process and to enhance public involvement during the rezoning and variance process associated with each individual case. With regards to legal conformity, issues currently in flux or that have been changed in recent years concern telecommunications, housing and HUD requirements, different factors regarding sign regulations and compliance. We have looked very carefully at the non-conforming uses standards and clarified and modified them to be in accordance with state law, and updating public hearing procedures for zoning decisions regarding rezonings and special use approvals, again, to be consistent with current state laws and standards. This slide, full of words, gives much more detail on these legal conformity factors, and I invite you to review this as you access this document on the city's website. So on to the next steps, and very quickly on to question and answer. We are here on May 12th, the virtual open house, where we will transition now from presentation into question and answer discussion. We have set the deadline of May 15th to receive public comments from the open house. Effectively, we're extending this open house over several days in a virtual sense and inviting everyone to review and submit comments using the specified email address. On May 21st, we're scheduled for a Planning Commission hearing for review and discussion regarding the draft zoning ordinance. And then June 2nd and June 11th are the intended first and second reading dates for mayor and council. The zoning ordinance complete draft, as indicated, will be posted prior to the Planning Commission meeting. And at this point, we will shift to a question and answer session, and we very much look forward to engaging your questions that have been submitted by email. And we invite you now, if you would like to pose additional questions, please do so using the email address identified right here on this slide, cosfzoningRewrite@peqatl.com, which is the same email address that's been used throughout the process. I will ask at this point Inga to back online and facilitate our Q&A discussion. Thank you very much.
The Wood Consulting Team and the City of South Fulton, again, thank you for your participation this evening. You know that we normally would be in front of you, but we want to acknowledge the good work that the City of South Fulton's IT and consulting staff have helped us with this evening. We hope that the recording or the presentation was informative to you. It was meant to provide an overview for you. But now we'd like to move right into our Q&A session. We want to be mindful of your time. And how we're going to start with the Q&A is we had asked previously and requested for some initial comments and questions to be submitted through our dedicated email address. I think we have that still on the screen for you to see. So we've gone through those and we did receive some, and we thank you for those. We've gone through those questions and comments, and even the comments we've turned into questions so that we can address some of the issues that were brought up in those submittals. But while we're doing that, we want you to continue to send any questions to us via that email address at cosfzoningRewrite@peqatl.com. All right, so we're going to get started with the Q&A. Lee Walton, our project manager, and the other voice that you heard on the presentation, who gave you that presentation, is going to walk through some of the questions, and we'll walk through some answers for you. But please stay with us and submit any additional questions to that email. Lee, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you go and unmute your button. There you go.
Okay. Thank you, Inga. Thank you, everyone, for being patient with this format and this process. Like Inga, I would much rather be in the room with you. That's how we've done this for decades and decades, but we're in a new scenario now, so we're working with it as best we can, and we appreciate you working with us and being willing to email your comments in instead of just raising your hands and having discussion with us. Like Inga said, we did receive several questions based on a review that some of you completed before the meeting started. And let me just point out for a second that this is called an open house, and an open house is a format that we typically use when we get towards the end of a planning or zoning process like this. In a normal physical open house, we set up in a room and we are open for several hours. And during that time, it's an open house. You come in, you review information. We have a discussion. At some point, we have a presentation like we just did. But it's a period of time within which information is reviewed and discussion happens. In this case, being virtual, we're actually extending the open house across several days. So the information that would normally be in posters on easels in the room, it's all posted on the city's webpage. It's on the zoning rewrite webpage, and that's been shown in the presentation. And we'll bring that up again and make sure it's clear for everyone where to go to see all this information. So everything that's on there would be available in the physical room if this were a normal open house. And then the other thing is that we, using this virtual format, are leaving it open for several days instead of several hours. So we invite you to continue to review and to continue to email in questions and comments up until the end of this week, and all that will be taken into account as we go through the process. So that said, some of the questions we've received so far have made note of. What is the schedule for releasing the full document and for going forward from here? So as mentioned in the presentation, there are 10 articles to the new zoning ordinance. That's reduced down from 34 articles. That's an organizational thing. It's not that we've reduced the content by that much. But those articles in their draft form are going to be posted to the same webpage starting next week. So after we've received all the comments from this open house process, we'll factor those in, and then we'll post the articles. And then on Thursday of next week, May the 21st, is the scheduled Planning Commission meeting to discuss the zoning ordinance rewrite process as well. So this is going to carry through this week and into next week. And so we do ask you to submit your comments based on the information presented today by the end of this week using the same email address. And then the other thing I want to point out is that when the document is posted, there's maybe some concern about all these pages and how to review them and how to compare what's being changed with what we're familiar with in the ordinance in the existing 34 chapters. The way the documents will be posted, it will be very clear what content is being changed. It'll be showing track changes in a color-coded scheme that will make it very easy to determine and discern what's new or different information compared with what has been in the ordinance up to this point. Anybody want to add anything else of my esteemed panel here? I think I covered that one. Trust me, I'm going to rely on the expertise of the team as we go through some more of these questions. So another important question, are properties being rezoned as a part of this process? And you saw in the presentation, and if you go to the website, you'll see that there is an updated zoning map that accompanies this. I'm going to ask Paige to give me a break and just give a quick response to the zoning map aspect of this and the extent to which that involves any property rezoning.
Thanks, Lee. Yeah, as you mentioned and as presented in the PowerPoint, there are no properties that are proposed to be rezoned as part of this process. There was, as indicated in the presentation, the fact that the M1A district is being consolidated, if you will, into the M1 district. And so for any properties that are currently zoned M1A, which is an industrial classification, those will be changed on the map to M1. But otherwise, there's nothing in the way of anyone's properties being affected by the adoption of an updated zoning ordinance.
Okay, thanks, Paige. Another question. So in the presentation and on the materials online, exterior finishes on buildings and changes to what's allowed as exterior materials is mentioned. So some specific questions that have come through about that. Will that apply to non-residential as well as residential buildings? What are the requirements that are being changed, and who will be grandfathered? To whom will this apply? So the standards are being updated for residential and non-residential buildings, not necessarily equally or exactly the same, but appropriately so. The focus is primarily on vinyl siding and synthetic stucco siding. So you'll see restrictions related to that have not been specific in the code citywide up to this point. For much of the city, according to the overlay districts that have been in place, there are restrictions on these materials already. So this is adding a citywide focus to restrictions that have been in only some overlays up to this point. And these will apply to new development only, or major redevelopment activities that require permitting. There will be no retroactive requirement or no requirement for any existing homeowner or business owner to replace exterior materials as a result of these requirements. Is there anything else from the team to add to that point? Okay. Heads nodding, good. So another question that came up, and I am going to ask your help on this one, Paige, again. Why are there some in the let me back up on the uses table. In the presentation, I mentioned very briefly that the listing of allowable uses is now organized into a consolidated table, as opposed to text lists within the different zoning classifications. Makes it a much easier process to identify uses and where they're allowed. And it also provides a much more robust list of uses based on the NAICS code, which is coordinated with the city's business licensing processes. So all that said, from someone who has looked at the table, the full table is available on the website. From someone who has looked at it, the question, why are there some retail uses shown in districts other than or in addition to the C1 and C2 districts? So Paige, if you don't mind speaking to that quickly.
There are some uses that are identified as accessory uses that would be appropriate for retail in an office building, if you will, such as a coffee shop that might be on the ground floor. So that's the intent. Of course, we'll go back through to make sure that for any principal uses, which would be the primary uses in an office district, we'll go through one more time on the use table to ensure that everything is as it's intended to be office uses primarily. So we'll do another once over, but generally the emphasis on anything that's not retail is intended to be a supportive accessory use as part of an office building.
Okay, thanks, Paige. And we will welcome and appreciate any additional questions or comments about the uses table. That's a big part of this zoning update, is really thoroughly updating the presentation, the table for allowable uses, for those uses that require special approval by City Council, and of course for those that are not allowed in each zoning district. A next question also concerning uses that can be allowed or accommodated in some districts. How can some large lot type uses or large uses be accommodated in zoning districts that allow small lots? For example, your R4 and your R5 type districts are designed with minimum lot sizes that are quite small. So how can you have certain types of uses, say a church, for example, that could work within those districts. And the initial response is that just because a district has a minimum lot size doesn't mean that lots can't be larger within that district, one. And then two, for these uses other than residential, which make possible the smallest lot sizes, there are various dimensional requirements, and in some cases special approval requirements, that would require an adequate sized lot in order for that use to happen. Paige, maybe you can elaborate on that a little bit, or anyone else.
Yeah, no, Lee, that was well put. I think there was mention made of some other accessory uses like private riding stable in a residential classification. That's consistent with what is currently in the code, but there are standards that apply. It's not just going to happen anywhere. You have to have a large enough lot to support that. And then with churches is another, I think you had mentioned. There are for that and other types of assembly type uses, we call them. There are standards that come into play to ensure that there aren't negative implications from parking and other aspects that might be generated from a use such as that that may be considered in a residential area.
Okay, thanks. Anyone else, if you want, just raise your hand. I'll be happy to hear from anyone and everyone. A related question, moving on. What about potentially incompatible uses within the same zoning classification that are allowable within the same zoning classification? Like, for example, a church and nightclub can both be uses possible within a commercial zoning classification. And I think the response there is that there are different distancing requirements from certain uses that would apply to uses that involve alcohol licenses. There are distancing requirements. And in other circumstances, there are special use or distancing requirements. There is an intent from the comprehensive plan and carrying into the zoning ordinance to allow, and in many cases, or in some cases, even promote mixed use in specific areas in the city. So we're not consistent with our comprehensive plan and land use policy. We're not requiring through zoning complete separation of uses that have differences. But in most cases, that is the policy. And then in many cases, there are distance requirements and other approval requirements intended to limit incompatible uses being adjacent to each other, where that would really be problematic. Did I leave out anything in that response, anyone? Okay. On the topic of churches, we've mentioned this several times. One question, how could, or would it be appropriate to allow churches in residential districts? And wouldn't that result in some properties and buildings that are too small being turned into churches, for example? There are, I'm going to ask Paige to chime in on this. There are specific requirements, or there are limitations placed by federal law and case law on how much churches can be restricted from a land use standpoint. But there are in the ordinance standards that require adequate size lots, adequate size buildings for a church. If you don't mind expanding on that, Paige.
Yeah, just to add that currently the zoning ordinance under the current regulations that apply in the city, any church that's proposed in a residential area, or actually any district, is required to get what's called a use permit, but we're now transitioning to the term special use approval, which must be reviewed by council, so that as I mentioned before, if there are implications given the size of the facility, and what that may mean for adjacent properties of a larger scale facility and parking, et cetera, then that would be considered as part of the special use approval process. It's not singling out churches, but it's treating churches similarly as other assembly uses where people gather. Schools is another example that it may be appropriate to locate a school, a private school, in or near a residential area. But like a church, it too has to go before council for consideration as a special use approval, part of the process in the city.
Okay, thanks, Paige. A reminder, Inga, do you want to provide a reminder for us as we're going through? Please email questions. And you're unmuting. Oh, there you go.
Actually have received a few more.
Okay, all right, very good.
Yeah, let's go there.
I have a few more in my pre-submitted questions list here. I'll go through those if that's all right, and then we'll get to those that are coming in. Okay.
Yeah.
But please continue to send questions in if you would. So it was mentioned in the presentation regarding the overlay districts that in the Old National Overlay District, a modification is proposed to allow taller buildings in some circumstances. And the question is, might that be problematic when it comes to compatibility in a variety of factors? Compatibility with surrounding development, compatibility with the fact that it's close to the airport, and so forth. The intent there is to allow greater than the standard height limit in order to facilitate redevelopment, mixed-use development, to recognize that corridor as having some of the taller buildings in the area, whether they're in the city or adjacent to the city. But it's very important to recognize that FAA height limitations apply, and height allowances must be verified through the FAA for anything in the Old National area. And also that there's a process being incorporated for detailed administrative review and approval for anything proposed above the standard height limit within the Old National area. Was there anything else Old National overlay related, Paige?
Just to add on for someone wanting to propose a building that is higher than what's currently allowed in the area, you mentioned the administrative variance process. It would give the community development director an opportunity to consider the proposal against certain criteria, and would be also inclusive of a public notification process. So it's not necessarily going to happen by right that someone can come in with a taller building, but there's an opportunity for such a proposal to be made and considered.
Okay, thanks. I have several more. Inga, are any other questions that have come in related to what we've been talking about so far?
No, they're somewhat different.
Different. Okay. All right.
So that kind of mix it up a little bit and we can come back. Let me say before we start reading questions that we're responding to these questions and we will also respond in writing. And so if you hear a response that you would like some clarification on, or is not what you were expecting, or if there was something different that you meant, please let us know, because we're responding based on where we are in the process and what has been submitted to us. But and then we'll also do a summary document of all questions that we hear. So let's move forward to some that have been submitted. We thank you for listening to us. Here's a question that we get asked frequently and is an issue for a lot of people. And it says, am I correct that zoning conditions will not expire if construction has not actually begun within a certain number of years? Currently, zoning conditions expire if the property is not developed within a certain period of time.
I'm going to ask one of my esteemed experts here to answer that. I guess, maybe we have both our opinion and take on that related to this update, but also Dana, maybe if you'd be willing to chime in on any actual experience from your working with these issues in reality.
Interestingly enough, I haven't experienced that yet. So I really don't have much to add to that. Most of the cases that have come through did proceed with the construction. I guess when we had the economic turn, some builders did come in to complete, so they did have to make some changes to maybe some of the conditions, but that's as far as it went.
Okay. Anyone else want to chime in? All right. Another question is, the lighting levels for commercial areas in some of the overlay districts are quite low. Apparently, they are being increased. What recommendations have public safety officials made regarding increased lighting levels?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'll start it by saying, in principle, there are two aspects of increasing over time lighting levels in the city. One aspect is zoning related, and another aspect is not. So when it comes to the existing road corridors throughout the city, and they vary dramatically because the city geography varies dramatically. In more urbanized areas, there's much more light. You've got some very rural areas where there's practically no light at all. When it comes to those existing corridors, zoning is not going to have much of an effect on adding street lighting where there is none presently. That's going to be more of a capital improvement function over time, investing in lighting infrastructure as a part of public improvement road projects. But when we're talking about commercial parking lots, residential developments, and so forth that take place over time, the zoning guidelines do and are being refined and updated to better address that level of lighting, to require specific, the technical terminology is foot candle levels within parking lots, especially along new subdivision streets, I believe, as well. So the standards are there. The standards are being updated to uniformly allow, and in some cases even encourage, LED lighting. So we're using the latest technology, certainly so that we're allowing the latest technology, and in many cases disallowing older, inefficient technologies. And the standards include what are called night sky or dark sky provisions that require lighting fixtures to be shielded so that the light is directed to what is intended to be lighted, whether it's the parking lot or the sidewalk or what have you, and not spilling out into adjacent properties or upwards into the sky. And it's a commonly available lighting technology. It's not challenging or difficult. It's just a matter of appropriate requirements. Anybody else, anything to add to that? Okay.
Sounds good. All right.
Oh, one more thing I would say on that, Inga, is that within the past couple of years, the City Council took action to revise lighting standards for the Sandtown overlay based on specific projects and issues there. So we have used those standards and that recent revision for Sandtown as a basis for citywide standards.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. And another question from one of our online submittals. The notes previously made available indicated that some uses in C1 and C2 zoning would require special permission, but did not specify them. What are those items in C1 that will require permission?
Ooh. That's not going to be one that we can just, I think, answer off the top of our heads. But the nature of the uses table that is fully posted on the website is such that you can look at it different ways. You can look down the rows at uses that you're particularly interested in, and then carry across and see whether in each district those uses are allowable by right, or if they require a special use, or if they're not allowed. So if you're interested in particular uses and you want to know whether they're allowed or require a special use in certain districts, scroll down through the list, find those uses through the table, find the use and look across and see. If you're more interested in understanding within a particular district, say C1, which uses are require special use permit as opposed to allowable, then you can take the C1 column and trace down it and see where there is a S as opposed to an A. Is that right, Paige? In the listing, and determine. So honestly, there are so many detailed uses described in the table that without pulling up the table and referring to it, we really couldn't say, I don't think off the top of our heads, which ones apply to which.
I think with respect to possible or special use consideration where a use in the C1 district has to go for council review and approval, I think they're primarily concentrated under the personal care services, which I think was touched on in the presentation, Lee, such as barbershops, beauty salons. So you'll find a cluster there, but they're treated similarly as for both C1 and C2. Special use approval is required for some of those uses. But otherwise, as you mentioned, you can scroll through to see for any other type of commercial use or use allowed in C1, whether it's allowed by right or special use consideration by council.
Okay. All right. Those are a couple. We have some more, but I'll let you, we can switch back to some of the ones that you have, Lee, and then
Sure.
perhaps we'll end with some of our online. Good stuff.
Okay.
Thank
All right,
you.
good.
Thank you. Encourage them to continue sending their
Please.
comments and questions.
Yeah, please. Thank you. That's great. So back to some of the questions from prior to the meeting. It was mentioned in the presentation that there'll be there's a proposal for additional buffering to be added in or as an added requirement to new residential development when it's adjacent to another jurisdiction. I won't call out any specific jurisdictions. There are many of them all across the city. We want to treat all those circumstances equally when property in South Fulton is adjacent to any other jurisdiction. The concern here is based on what has occurred, and feel free to elaborate, anyone, but we've had circumstances where in adjacent jurisdiction, I'll just say development incompatible with low density or single family residential has sprung up in people's backyards with very little buffering, and that has understandably caused concern. The fact of the matter is that South Fulton had, though, their efforts for intergovernmental coordination and cooperation and being good neighbors and all these things, South Fulton does not have really legal or jurisdiction over zoning in adjacent cities. So the means to protect future homebuyers and homeowners in these developments that will very likely be built next to adjacent jurisdictions is to provide additional buffering on the South Fulton side. So the proposal is to require a zoning buffer. I think it's written in as a 100-foot zoning buffer along property lines of new developments, not the individual lots, but the overall development adjacent to other jurisdictions. That way, when homes are built in South Fulton, in the future, development across the city limits would be buffered from those homes. I think that answers. Anything to add to that one? I think that covers that. Then related, there was a question about what is currently section 4.23.1 in the zoning ordinance concerning landscape strips and buffers. And the question to what extent are those requirements being changed? And there are some overlapping regulations, or there's opinion that there is, and is that being worked out? And I think I'll start by saying basically what we're doing outside of the zoning buffer I just mentioned for that special circumstance of adjacent to other jurisdictions, we are doing what we can to clarify and clean up landscape strip and buffer requirements, but we are not at this point proposing really substantial changes to those requirements. So what has been in effect regarding normal buffers and landscape strips is really still going to be in effect per the zoning ordinance update. Okay. So here's one. I'm going to ask Paige for you to help on this one. I think, why do the new setback requirements, I think we're talking about the staggered setback requirements, front setbacks that was mentioned in the presentation. Why do those apply only to R4, R4A, R5, and R5A? Why not also to the mixed use and CUP and similar categories?
Right. So for some of the zoning districts where there could be a mix in lot sizes or mix in housing types, such as the MIX or CUP zoning districts, the dimensions, which would include the setbacks of each of the dwellings, that would be established as part of the rezoning process when someone comes to the city and wants to develop a neighborhood. As such, then they would propose what the front setbacks would be, side setbacks, the minimum lot size, those type of things would be established as part of the rezoning process. And there can be discussion and consensus by council at that time as far as what the setbacks would be.
Okay, thanks.
I can add to this.
Yeah, please, Dana. Thank you.
So we have the advantage with staff when an applicant comes in that we can review their intentions with that particular site, and we can go over their setbacks. We can go over the fact that they will need staggers, and if that fits into their plan, then we'll set it in place. And this is a good segue. I wasn't completely clear with the first answer I had in regards to conditions, but when you do have a rezoning, whether they have conditions, they stay with that case. So for instance, if you have a case that was in 2004 and it's today, 2020, those conditions will still apply to that particular parcel or land, and it could be a CUP. However, it could be outdated. So if that's the case, then they would come in for what is called a modification. And with that modification, they can ask to either increase the setback, reduce the setback, maybe even change some materials that are outdated from that time, and we have better materials now. So if they go through that process and it's approved, they will go for a building permit. And with that building permit, if a certain extended time passes, then that permit can expire, and they would have to reapply for that permit.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of related to that, another question is, and this ties, so up to this point, in a lot of cases, I believe the requirement for staggered setbacks in these certain zoning districts has been added as a condition of zoning through the rezoning process. Correct. by city council, right? Yeah.
Yes.
So this question sort of follows along there. When conditions are added in the process of rezoning, and this was mentioned also in the presentation, why are we talking about them as required to be stated in the official council motion? And what kinds of other process changes are being proposed relative to this? In other words, what procedurally, what is changing? Is anything dramatically changing?
I think the only thing we might have is we may not need as many conditions put in place because it will already be in the ordinance. So if most properties classifications require the staggers, then it wouldn't be necessary to put it into that condition.
Right. Okay. Right. Good.
And any
And I think the other
condition-
thing I would, yeah, go ahead, Paige,
Sorry.
please. Thank you.
No, just as far as process, so any conditions these are additional requirements above and beyond the minimum standards in the zoning ordinance that are approved or requested to be part of a rezoning by council, meaning those additional conditions are approved by council as part of a rezoning. You mentioned having to be part of the motion. In order for any additional requirements or conditions of a zoning or conditions of approval to be valid, it has to be integrated into the motion by council. We can't just say, well, we approve the rezoning from X to Y. The motion has to include reference to the conditions, not necessarily a line item detailed listing as part of the minutes, but it needs to make reference to the conditions that were submitted and discussed, and whether it's a graphic representation with a site plan or photos that are submitted by the applicant, anything that's discussed during the meeting has to somehow be summarized and incorporated into the motion, or else all of those things that the applicant agreed to during the meeting, they won't hold after the fact.
And this is one of those areas where we're making updates to bring us into compliance with some of the latest legal factors, right? Some of the latest legal requirements that come as a result of Supreme Court cases, either at the state or at the federal level.
Right. And just also just from practical experience, as has happened in some communities, that if you don't give the level of detail in the motion being made, you can't hold the applicant to just discussion that transpired that they may have agreed to. You have to make sure that there's something in writing.
Okay.
And sometimes we have staff recommendations. So a motion can be made to approve that particular petition with staff's recommendations.
Got it.
Exactly.
Okay. Very important to be specific about all that. Inga, that completes the list of preliminary questions I had. I'll let you facilitate from here on out.
Okay, that's good, because our time is also winding down, and I've had a request to make sure that I introduce all of our panelists.
Oh, thank you.
Let's end on that note, but let me go back and do one or two more, go back and field one or two more questions. Here's one. What is the definition? Let's see, pull this up here. Minimize my screen. What is the definition of new development for grandfathering? Zoning, LDP, or final plat? Building permit applied for? Just kind of talk a little bit about grandfathering. That was something that we heard as well from a lot of our members of the public.
Okay, so I guess I can just give an example. Let's say, for instance, we had a non-compliant sign or a sign that was up, but then the regulations changed. And if that business goes out of business within a certain amount of time and someone else comes in, then that particular sign can be grandfathered in. If it goes beyond that time, then the regulations, that applicant would have to comply with those regulations. So there's a certain amount of time that a situation is given, and if it expires without of that time, then it goes into compliance with what is required.
The terminology that will be used in the ordinance and is used in the ordinance and that we'll be modifying, we don't use the term grandfather, we use the term non-conforming use. So if you're looking, when the ordinance articles are posted next week, if you're looking for the specific language about this issue, look for the term non-conforming use. That's where you'll find that.
Yeah, that's good. That's an important point, Lee. And I think I'll leave it at that for our questions. We had just one or two more, but I think we're good. I want to say thank you again and remind our viewers and our listeners that we've been working at this for a long time, well over a year. And you've encountered a lot of us, and all of the people you see here on this panel started with the process, and we're going to end with the process. I'm going to start and introduce again Lee Walton, who is our project manager from Wood and has led this effort from the beginning, as I mentioned. I have Anna Johnson from Wood also. Many of you have seen Anna, and we've been to lots of meetings together. We have Paige Hatley from Hatley Plans, and she too has been with us from the beginning. And I'm Inga Kennedy again with the Wood consulting team. My company is PEQ, responsible for public engagement and stakeholder involvement. And so the four of us have been with you since the beginning, and we have enjoyed working with you and have enjoyed working in this process with you, and look forward to winding things down. I want to introduce our two City of South Fulton staff members who are here with us. Dana Gray. Dana, I guess everybody knows here. Thank you for being with us. And then we have Marissa Jackson, who is here with us tonight. And again, we want to thank the City of South Fulton's IT staff, support, and consultants in helping us bring this together. It was really good to be able to do this in light of what we're working with now. And so we appreciate it. Just some reminders. It's very important to take the time to go through the website and look at all of the postings and all of the materials that are there. We are going to continue to accept your comments and do that all week. So don't think that this is the end of comment period. There's a long way to go in that regard, but we would like for you to, and encourage you to go to the website and view some of the documents and drill down to some of the things that you've asked us about tonight, and send those comments in to us by Friday, May 15th. That will help us begin to compile comments and review where there may need to be some adjustments, and be prepared to go to our next steps in the process, meeting with the Planning Commission and the Mayor and Council. And with that, if all minds are clear, we are going to sign off. And again, thank you so much for your participation in the City of South Fulton's zoning rewrite update process. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Inga. Thank you, everyone.